all of us, I'm sure, are on the research highway. And when you're starting off, I believe as researchers, you tend to look at it as a high-speed chase. You're chasing how many publications can I get? How many papers can I get out there? And I believe that is a mistake. We're here to tell you that research is actually more of a slow climb, and you have to really take your time to be able to produce some good work that is publishable and that is able to communicate your findings, that is able to communicate something that is worth sharing with the body of knowledge. Oh, there we go. So the question is, how do we move from the bedside to paper? As surgeons, it's a huge challenge. I assume all of us are either surgeons or surgeons in the making. I think there's some students as well. So how do you convert, the information from the bedside to paper? It's a huge question that I hope that by the end of today would have been able to address. The basic principle underlying clinical research is, number one, you have to have an interest. Number two, you have to be able to communicate and translate what you practice clinically into something that is scientifically sound and can be disseminated with the general scientific community. Many people have different reasons for research. Most of us do it because we need to graduate. You cannot graduate without a research, so it's shoved down our throats. And it is assumed that at the end of your master's program, your MEd program, you must have a dissertation. Others, the younger researchers, the younger consultants, early career researchers, may be doing it in pursuit of a professorship. I know that's very common on the research highway. A lot of people will be targeting several publications in order to become a professor. Others, higher up the research ladder, may actually be in it for grant money, which is not a bad thing. If you can write good enough grant proposals and get your research funded, that's good. But then the question is, what is your motive? For others may just be bookworms. They just like to read and write and move on like that. So there are very many different motives behind clinical research. So what should be the motive for clinical research? Well, first of all, clinical research is problem-based solution design. So we're able to look at the problems we are experiencing as surgeons on the African continent, and we're able to design solutions that are specific to our problems. One of the common things we find is a lot of us in our different fields of practice tend to use guidelines that were formulated based off research that may not be local to us, that may be foreign to us, research off the continent, research by other people who are not us. So clinical research is important because it allows us as custodians of the patients, as custodians of the practice on the continent, to be able to design solutions to our own problems. Second of all, clinical research allows us to advance the field. With the advances in medicine, it's important that we keep up as well, and we're able to advance our individual fields. From my experience in the field of urology, there is urological guidelines that are published every year by the Western countries. You've got the Americas, you've got the Europe, but we don't really have African guidelines. And the first step to getting the African urology guidelines would be, for example, to have clinical research in, across the different fields in urology. Third of all, clinical research allows us to broaden the knowledge base and close knowledge gaps. So it's not just a prerequisite for our dissertations. We should look at it more broadly as adding to the knowledge base, not just for nationally, locally, but regionally as well. The next argument that always comes up is that I cannot balance research and clinical practice. So therefore, I would rather just stick to my clinical practice. Research is time consuming, it's difficult, it's demanding, and a lot of us are unmotivated. There's no incentive for research. I would argue that clinical practice is equally time consuming, can be difficult, is very demanding. And in several African countries, people may not even be motivated enough, they may not have incentive enough to proceed with clinical practice. Therefore, the two are basically the same, the different sides of the same coin. You cannot have clinical need solving. It would be folly to be naive and think that what I do on the ward has no impact on the knowledge base of surgery in Africa. Clinical data is a tool, and that's the mindset we need to change to. Clinical data is information. It's a tool that we can use as our basis of research. As we go out throughout today, we'll see how to formulate a research question. We're going to see how to convert your thesis to a manuscript. We're going to see how to analyze data. So I think it's very important that we are very familiar with our, our clinical data. So first of all, it's a foundation for uncovering knowledge gaps. How will you know what's missing? How will you know what is not there if it's not coming from the very words you work on every single day? The other thing with clinical data is that it's relevant to the national and regional needs. You cannot develop clinical research based on patients you don't see, based on, say, a clinical practice that you're not involved in. That just makes you irrelevant. So the clinical data that we do have, the ward work, the hospital work that you are doing today is actually a tool for research for tomorrow. It's also important that you see your clinical practice, everything you generate in your clinical practice as data that allows for coherence between the research, the focus of research in your country, in your hospital, in your region, and current practice. Gone are the days where we are using, like I said, guidelines from Looks like I dropped off briefly. Sorry. Okay, so I was saying to be inquisitive as a surgeon, to be inquisitive as a healthcare practitioner, a medical student, wherever you are in your career, it means taking further steps to verify. So you have to be very observant. Every single piece of information that comes across your desk, that comes across you, is potentially a point of research. I know we all know the old adage of publish or perish. These days, it's evolved from publish or perish all the way up to publish frequently in high impact journals, and maybe you won't perish. Here at Annals, we like to have a different approach to things. Traditionally, you start with an idea. If you don't do anything about it, you'll perish. Maybe you progress to carrying out a research, but you don't publish it, then you perish. After the research, you need to formulate it into a manuscript, look for a journal to publish in, and maybe you don't do that, you perish. Or maybe you finally reach the end of the publish or perish cycle, where you publish and you start the cycle all over again. We like to remove the perish, and we like to say that as we're growing in our clinical practice, converting our clinical practice, our clinical findings into focuses of research, you realize that it's actually a publish and grow cycle. So you see things on the ward day to day. You should ask, why is it like this? Already your mindset is that of a researcher, that of being inquisitive, that of finding solutions to your problems. A lot of us practice in hospitals which may be under-resourced, and we do things that may or may not be documented, but are safe and sound surgical practice. Take that upon yourself and let it be an idea. Use it as a focus for growth, and possibly look.
Dr. Mumba, yeah. Your slides are not showing.
They're not showing?
Yes.
Okay, it's almost the end. Let's see if I can, but I'm showing. Am I showing? Okay. How about now?
Yes, you are. Yes, sir. Okay, now that's good. Just
now it is. Okay. Okay. Is that visible now?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So I was saying that we all know the evolution of publish or perish, and it evolved from publish or perish all the way up to publish frequently and maybe you won't perish. The research cycle starts from the beginning with an idea, and then usually a lot of us drop off by not taking it up. Some may proceed to research and maybe not write anything about it, and then they perish. Or maybe you write, but you don't publish, then you perish. Finally, those of us who get to the end of the cycle will publish and start the cycle again. So the encouragement is that we need to move away from that and move to the publish and growth cycle, where we take keen interest in correlating our clinical work to answering actual problems that we are facing. So a lot of us, like I said, work in very resource limited settings, and we have to be very innovative in our practice. Why don't you pick one of those things, look into the history of it, look into where it started from, compare with what other hospitals in similar settings are doing already. You're looking into research, you are inquisitive, and you are asking the questions and finding answers. Like that, we go into, we move from the publish or perish to the publish and grow. And by the time you reach the publishing section of the cycle, you are experiencing more growth and the cycle can continue. So that's a brief introduction to why, more of why, not how, more of why we should really take keen interest in translating our clinical data, our clinical practice, and translating it into a research projects, translating it into even as simple as an audit. We'll go through in the next few sessions the different types of research papers that we are able to do. So at this point, I've already introduced the speakers. I think the speakers will just be coming on one after the other. Do enjoy the rest of the day. Sorry about the technical glitches on my side. Over to you. Who is the next speaker? Dr. Mose. Is Dr. Mose on? Oh, there we are.
Thank you, Dr. Mumba. I hope I can be heard.
Yes, you are audible and visible.
Thank you. So I'll be taking you through publication ethics. My name is Dr. Mora Mose. I'm an assistant editor at the Annals of African Surgery. Onyango, kindly assist me with that. Yeah, thank you. So this is how we shall be tackling the topic of publication ethics. We shall go through the introduction of what it is, the definition, the guiding force of it, and the types of publication ethics. Then we shall delve into plagiarism, authorship, conflict of interest, and images. All this is in the course of being safe in this authorship world. You know, in every house we have rules and regulations. So as we try to chase our publication into the publish or perish, there are rules that we need to play within. So in this era where everyone is talking about publish or perish, we are urged not to focus on career advancement through numerous publications while ignoring research publication ethics, as this may have detrimental consequences. Academic publishing depends mainly on trust. This was said by Graf et al. In his paper, because at times we are not able to fully verify what the authors are writing. We may go to an extent as editors to try and verify, but we cannot fully verify. So we really depend on trust of the authors. Scientists are generally perceived as well-intentioned seekers of truth, and we should not ruin this, especially in the public. Let us keep it that way so that we are the people who generate knowledge. And if we are able to be truthful, then we are going to get a lot of public trust. And universities are perceived as cathedral and would really want to keep it this way. They are cathedral of learning as producers of knowledge and vital to health and welfare of the society. I would want to remind us about Huang. Huang did some revolutionary work on stem cell that was published in the year 2004-2005. Later, his work was found to be fake, and this had detrimental consequences to the extent of him losing his license and losing his practice as well. So you can see how far it can go when you really do not play within the rules. So publication ethics provides a code of conduct and best practice guidelines in ethics of scholarly publishers. It provides guidelines on how to handle research and publication misconduct. It also ensures high quality scientific publication. It ensures that we get public trust in scientific finding and that people receive credit for their work. We have some guiding forces in ethical publication. There are many, but the most common ones are the ICMGE, which is the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. We also have COP. COP is quite common, I think, amongst all of us. It's the Committee of Publication Ethics, and WAME, which is the World Association of Medical Editors. This organization generally creates policies that are used in publication ethics, and every journal is tasked to develop its own guidelines based on the ones that were given by the organization. So you may track it a bit, but you must keep your team on task so that they are able to ensure that the work that is published is true. So there are different types of publication ethics. We have plagiarism, data accuracy, which is fabrication and falsification. We also have ethical approval and informed consent, ethics of authorship, which include guidelines on authorship, types of authorship misconduct. We have conflict of interest and submission fraud. Today, I'm going to specifically be talking about plagiarism, ethics of authorship, and conflicts of interest. So plagiarism comes from a Latin word, plagiaris, which means kidnapper. It is the use of previously published work by another author in one's own manuscript. So you use their work without consent, credit, and acknowledgement. So you may use someone's work, but when you do not seek their consent, credit, or you do not acknowledge them, then this is termed as plagiarism. Plagiarism is a cardinal sin of scholarship. Copying someone's work, improper citation, failure to cite, false citation, turning in another person's work, all this is incorporated in plagiarism. Plagiarism is basically intellectual theft and academic cheating, and no one of us should be caught up in this at any time. There are different types of plagiarism. There is accidental and deliberate. So when the author goes through your work and find that you have plagiarized, some actually come up and say it was accidental. They could be saying the truth or not, but at the end of the day, it really is plagiarism. Some deliberately take someone's work, put their names, and submit it for publication. That is deliberate plagiarism. And there's also, you can plagiarize in form of text, images, data, music, or art. Whichever way you plagiarize, it doesn't have to be a text. Even an image, if you pick an image from someone's work and you present it as your own, that is plagiarism. If you pick someone's data and you actually generate a paper from their data without seeking their consent or acknowledgement, that is plagiarism. Again, there is global, which is complete, patchwork, or mosaic. Global is where you pick the entire paper and present it as your own. Patchwork is where you pick a part of their work, a certain section, and you present it. That is patchwork plagiarism. And it is the job of the editor to call you out. There's also self-plagiarism. This is whereby you recycle your own previous published or submitted work. For example, you published a paper and you presented it, for example, last year to a particular journal. And this year you decide you want to bring it to Annals of African Surgery Journal and you present it again. That is self-plagiarism, as much as it is still your own work. There was a study done in India. It was a large multi-center study that covered a vast geographical area. They were trying to look at the extent of awareness and attitude of plagiarism in postgraduate residents. The result of this study was dismal. It is very unfortunate that students who are doing their postgraduate, these are people who must publish to complete their training. They are not aware about plagiarism and what it entails. So I don't know what it is like in the region where you come from, but probably this could be a study question that you might want to pose and find out the awareness or the know-how of plagiarism, especially amongst residents. These are people who should know about plagiarism because they are publishing. So how do you mitigate plagiarism? You must acknowledge the information where it comes from. If it is not yours, acknowledge the person who produced the information. seek permission from them, cite. And when you cite, you summarize the original work. Also, another way of doing it is paraphrasing. You use your own words and reference the source, or you can quote it. Use of original author's words just as they are from the previous document, then put quotation marks and reference the original document. If you do any of this, then you will be safe from plagiarism. Consequences of plagiarism differ depending on the region you come from. They can range from you not completing your study to even as much as legal consequences, depending on what you have plagiarized. So you could fail your assignment, or you could fail to complete your training. You could lose funds or tenure. You could lose credibility, especially when the journal calls you out for plagiarizing several times. The next time you send a paper, we shall raise all alarms because we want to be sure that you're publishing real data. And in some countries, it could also result into legal consequences. So how do you qualify to be an author? According to ICMJE guideline, like I said, these are just guidelines, but different journals have their own guidelines. This one just gives a policy, and as you want to publish, it is good to have a look at the requirements of the journal you want to publish in. According to ICMJ, for you to be an author, you must have contributed substantially in the research process at whatever level that you did, either in study conception, designing, data acquisition, statistical analysis, whatever it is, but you must show some substantial contribution. Another bone of contention is usually the order of authorship. Ideally, though this is not cast on stone, it is pegged on involvement of contribution. The person who contributes the most gets the first authorship, and the person who contributes the least gets the last authorship. The first author and the corresponding author could be based on contribution, nomination, or voting. However, this is a subject that needs to be discussed before starting the study. You can see this is an example of people who are doing a study together, and the young man contributed a lot into the study process, but at the end of it all, he became et al. So you can see this matters actually could even raise legal matters. So this is a matter that must be discussed from the beginning before you kickstart. So what type of authorship misconduct exists? We have ghost authorship. This is like the young man we have just seen, the person who contributes the most, however, is not recognized or is recognized as et al. In the study. We also have honorary or gifted authorship. This is where someone gets authorship just based on affiliation to an institution. And then we have the guest authorship. These are the people who are put in as first authors or even second authors to improve the chances of their manuscript being accepted. So they pick someone who is more senior and they put as the first or second author just for the paper to be accepted in a particular journal. Then we have the coercive authorship. This is where we have senior researchers who bully the junior researchers by putting their name first or even totally deleting the junior researchers who have done all the work. This is an example where you see you do all the work and he takes all the credit. Probably he's the head of department, probably he's your mentor, or maybe he's more senior than you and he decides to take all the credit. This happens, and it happens a lot, just that it goes unsaid, but it happens. This is another example. This is an example of coercive type. You can see the first author is bigger and more louder, and hence he takes the first authorship. And the one who is smaller and more calm becomes et al. And probably the one who becomes et al. Did all the work. So agree on authorship order before commencing on the work so that it does not bring disputes at the time of publication when everyone has put in all the work. Allow me to quote some words from Mark Twain, where he says, authorship is not a trade, it is an inspiration. Authorship does not keep an office. Its habitation is all out under the sun, and everywhere the winds are blowing, and the sun is shining, and the creatures of God are free. So really, you don't have to buy authorship. You just need to sit down and get it done. Put some work in it, and you'll become an author. You can even be the first author if you put in enough work and convince the team that you've put in substantial contribution. So let's delve into conflict of interest in authorship. So the integrity of academic activity may be compromised by other competing interests. Just like any other business that you do, there are always competing interests. The cornerstone of science is that it should be objective and it has to remain unbiased. For example, when you receive gains in terms of career or financial by publishing particular results, it is always questionable whether you were compromised. For example, if you're publishing a paper for you to get a couple of euros, it attracts some attention to your editors and question whether you are actually compromised by the money, or if they ask you to publish particular results for you to get a particular job or pay rise. So especially if not disclosed, if you keep quiet about it, then of course your authors are going to percuss you about it. You will have to declare your position in this. According to COPE guidelines, conflict of interest arises when authors have interests that are not fully apparent, but usually are revealed later and would make a reader feel misled or deceived. So at all times, disclose the position. According to WAME, conflict of interest exists when a participant in any of the publication process has a competing interest that could unduly influence her responsibility. So according to WAME, it is not only the author, it could also be the editor who has competing interests, probably has stakes in the paper, has stakes in whatever results are going to be published. So that could also create some conflict of interest on the editor's side, as much as we keep focusing on the author's side. So we have types of conflict of interest. We have direct or indirect. We also have financial versus non-financial. Whatever it is that you have conflict of interest in, it is advisable to declare it because when you allow the editor to call you out, then it already brings a lot of disagreement, I would say. Yeah. So conflict of interest cannot be totally eliminated, but should be managed. So for example, if you are given some finances, but does not directly influence the decision or the particular results that you are going to declare, then you should say it. That way, the editors have an easy time working with you. And even if they try to peruse through, they might actually find there was no interest. So there will always be something that can make people think that you were compromised. But when you declare it, it becomes a bit easier. According to WAME, WAME gives guidelines, but encourages all journals to formulate. So you might find the guidelines differ from journal to journal, but they all originate from a particular guideline, either COPE or WAME. But according to most journals, you must give a full written statement on the conflict of interest and give a disclosure where it is necessary before submitting. And if there is a sponsor in the research work, you should give the role of the sponsor as well, so that it is clear to the readers and to your editors. So what are your obligations as the author regarding conflict of interest? As the author, you must declare all forms of sponsorship in any stage of the research process. Always confirm if the journal has any conflict of interest policy so that you adhere to it upon submission of your manuscript. Also confirm the content of agreement with your sponsor. Some sponsors want you to publish particular results, either positive or negative, in order for you to get the sponsorship. This is of importance. Also confirm if your sponsor forbids you from publishing without prior approval of the sponsor himself. Another obligation of the author is to disclose any potential or actual conflict of interest, if any. So disclosure allows the readers to judge the research on its merits. Failure to disclose violates public trust. Author's credibility is damaged, and also journal credibility is at stake. When it comes to images, we know many scholarly publications are usually enhanced with images, which range from reproduction of fine art to graphs in order to complement the text. The journal guideline provides directives on image requirements, resolution, clarity, etc. So as you're submitting, kindly just have a look at the guidelines of that particular journal. And using of images raises copyright issues. So if your image is not original, just find out if it is copyrighted. And we know that copyright laws are a subspeciality in the legal profession, and it could result into legal repercussions if not adhered to. Intellectual property rights is guarded by the copyright, trademark, patent, trade secret, and others. So beware of privacy and publicity rights. Images with people, make sure you blur their eyes, faces, and private parts. Focus only on the subject matter. Also, you need to be aware about ArtStore. This is a subscription database that includes some images specifically licensed for academic publishing. So you find it is copyrighted, but if it is under ArtStore, then you can utilize it in your work. Also, you need to be aware about the fair use. This is use of limited use of copyright material. Not all copyright material are out of reach. If it is under fair use, then you can use it even if it's copyrighted. There are some principles that you need to be aware of, the copyright principles. These are the rights to publish a copyright image is controlled by the copyright owner. So if it is copyrighted and it is not under fair use, then you need to write to the copyright owner. And you need to do this in early enough, as this may delay the publication because it is quite a tedious process. We also have publication domain. These are images that the copyright has not been renewed, or initially they were copyrighted, but it has expired and currently it has not been renewed, or are indicated clearly and reliably that they are free. These are the public domain ones. So just be sure that it has expired before taking it up, because if it has not, then you need to write to the owner of the copyright. We also have the Creative Commons or the open access. This one has a collection of images that are licensed using Creative Commons licensing system. Mostly they permit for non-commercial uses only. So don't be caught up. If you use it for commercial uses, then it can attract legal consequences. Use of charts, graphs, and figures, where this is reproduced in a critical study of the work or to buttress any argument of the author, no permission is needed because data is not copyrightable. However, graphics like tables, charts are copyright protected, so beware and seek necessary permission where applicable. Diagrams from books or other publications should be acknowledged from the source. At all time, make sure you seek permission and give acknowledgement so that you remain safe at all times. So what aspects can you change in an image? Personal identifiers, the names, hospital number, face, eyes, national identification number. This one should not be shown at any particular time. Before publication, should be approved at the institution where you get the images. This is, for example, if you want to use X-rays or MRI or CT scans, as much as you're going to blur the names or the IP numbers, always remember to seek permission from the institution. So what are the consequences of research misconduct? It would result in public trust, like this, the story of Guang, the one who published and lost his license because of publishing fake material. The public now has lost a lot of trust, and it is upon us as authors and as editors to bring back the trust to the public. Also, we could lose government or institutional policies. This is because of misguiding. If you fake some results and publish them in favor of a particular policy, and the policy is not evidence-based, then we could misguide the government and institutions, and subsequently misguide the people. And the people is me and you, so we also get affected. It could also result in erroneous diagnosis and therapeutics. If, for example, you're doing your thesis and you're running out of time, and you're thinking, I got to graduate this year, and you decide you're going to sit in your house and collect your data in your house, and your study was about a particular algorithm of management, and the result is that you have faked all this. So the algorithm is going to be wrong, and we take up your study to change our management, then you see we're going to have a lot of errors. And by the time all this is corrected, a lot of lives will have been lost. It could also mislead other researchers, because as we do our research work, we know we also bank on previous data that has been released. So we use it to quote, we use it to create hypotheses. So you really have to be truthful in what you publish, as this affects even the future researchers as they look into your work to generate more study questions and also to work out hypotheses. So let us not allow misguidance. Ethics basically is tied down on trust and honesty, integrity, principles and reliability. And this is not trained in any school. It is the responsibility of all of us. And COPE, WAME, and other organizations have policies, and journals equally have some guidelines, and editors will work around the clock to ensure that if you do not have these virtues, then we're going to call you out to ensure that the work that is published remain to be as truthful as possible, so that the public equally gets the real deal, and which trickles down to me and you getting the real deal. So I would urge all of us to remain ethical as we are trying to chase the public or perish ideology. I know we all want to publish, but in every house there are norms, and these are the norms. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mose. I think we'll jump straight into the next speaker.
Hello, hi, Mumba. Hello, Mumba. Are you able to see my slide? My screen?
Ernest, we can see it very clearly and we can hear you loudly and clearly.
Okay, thank you. So my name is Dr. Ernest Kimani. I'm going to cover on data analysis in surgical research. So for you to do data analysis, what do you require? You need data that is then collected through sound methodological practice. And why do you need sound methodological practice? Because as it has been previously said, if you want to do a study to determine prevalence of COVID-19 in Nairobi, and you give us a very high prevalence, which is not the truth, the government may bring in lockdown measures which have far-reaching economic consequences. Or if you give us a very low prevalence, which is not the real truth, we may not take the measure seriously, and this may have also far-reaching consequences in terms of disease spread. So the data needs to be collected through sound methodological practice that minimizes bias and factors in other factors. And this process will generate variables, and then which will be administered through either a questionnaire or whatever format that is through data collection. And finally, once you have your data in a questionnaire or in structured data form, then you do data entry. There are many softwares that can be used for data entry and analysis. Access for Microsoft Word, Microsoft Access for data entry, Excel for data entry, I think for data entry, and even analysis, even Excel for analysis, and there are many. But at the end of the day, they tend to give more or less similar results. Perhaps the difference is how proficient you are in using a particular data analysis or entry tool. So once you enter your data, you need to prepare your data, and there are various processes to prepare your data. One of them is, so you need to clean it, and perhaps for those who do predictive modeling, you can do feature engineering. And the purpose of this is to remove outliers. For instance, if you want to measure economic capacity of a certain community, and there's one rich guy who owns the whole community, and you factor him in, and that, let's say that community has 1,000 people. You're gonna get results that say that guy that the community is so rich, yet it's only one guy who owns everything. So that is not the truth. That guy is an outlier. So you probably want to remove him and factor in this other majority of guys. So sometimes you can transform data through logarithmic scale to be able to compress it or to shrink it such that it's workable with, especially when you're doing graphs. Or you can convert continuous data to categorical. For instance, age. If you have age ranging from 0 to 90, perhaps you want to categorize 0 to 10, and that's one way to transform data. And also, we know that missing values do affect the results of your modeling. So you need probably to either remove them, impute them. However, there are still many other techniques that can be used in data preparation, but that depends on the kind of data that you do have. The first thing is to visualize your data. You want to see if you have a data set of age, you want to see how is it distributed. So you can run, there are many techniques for that, bar graphs for categorical data, pie charts for categorical data, box plot for continuous data, scatter plots when you're comparing two variables, line graphs. So the whole idea is you want to see your data in a graph, and that helps you to understand really what does your data really look like. Is it skewed to one side? Is it not skewed to one side? Or what is the distribution of various parameters within that data? So what are the methods that influence how you are going to analyze your data? It's one, you need to look at the study objective. Well, what are your study objectives? For instance, if you are doing a study on falls in the elderly, probably you want to, in terms of objectives, maybe you wanted prevalence first, so you're gonna calculate prevalence. And then the next thing you wanted to see how are these factors that are associated with that fall. So you're gonna follow those objectives to guide. But you must also be guided by the design of your study, because we know that when you're analyzing different study designs, there are different techniques for analyzing that. If you're going to use a meta-analysis, there are different techniques for analyzing meta-analysis than randomized control trials, or there are different techniques for analyzing case control trials when as compared to cross-section studies. And then you've got to be guided by whether is your data quantitative or qualitative. Quantitative, you know that you are collecting values of some sort, and qualitative, you are collecting opinions. So you cannot analyze those two data sets in similar manner. For quantitative data, you want to think, is it continuous or is it discrete or categorical? If it is continuous, then there are methods for that. We're going to look into that. If it's discrete, there are methods for that. And for continuous data, you want to think, is it parametric? Parametric, that is, does it follow normal distribution, or is it non-parametric? That is, does it not follow normal distribution? And also you should be guided by the number of groups. If are you comparing 2 groups versus 3 groups versus 5 groups? All those factors come in when you're choosing how to analyze your data. So normally the approach that most of the statisticians will give, probably you want to start with univariate. We're going to look into that. This is where you are looking at one variable first, and then you go to bivariate, where you're going to see how 2 variables interact. And then finally, you're going to do multivariate analysis, where you do either regression, correlation. And in this case, you want to see how do these factors, maybe 10 factors, influence an outcome, and which ones are those ones which are the strongest predictor of that particular outcome. So for univariate data analysis, normally here you're going to try to describe one variable. For instance, if it's a continuous, we talked of continuous versus categorical. If it is continuous, there are techniques for that. Maybe age, you can use mean age, standard deviation. How much does it deviate from the mean? You can use median, mode. You can give ranges, and ranges can be interquartile range. There can be various forms of ranges. And then if you're gonna do discrete, or if it's discrete or categorical data, probably you want to give us in proportions, like males who are maybe 70%, females who are 30%, or you can also give into ratios, ratio of males to female. So for continuous data analysis for bivariate, is that you can look at it in terms of, do you have parametric or non-parametric data? If it's a parametric, we said it follows normal distribution. Non-parametric, it doesn't follow normal distribution. And how do you determine whether the data follows normal or non-normal distribution? There are techniques for that. You can use a histogram. A histogram will give you a good visual guide on whether certain data does follow normal distribution. Whereas there are other statistical techniques such as Shapiro-Wilk test, there are QQ plots, which test whether the data is normally distributed against a p-value, and you get a fairly good estimate of this. For parametric test, assuming that you have a data set whereby you want to look at whether you have one sample or you have 2 groups, like you want to say, maybe to measure the weight amongst the boys versus girls in a classroom. So you have 2 groups, and assuming that this data is normally distributed based on how you had looked at it before, it's normally distributed. So probably here you're gonna use a t-test. And of course, there's a non-parametric version of a t-test, which is Mann-Whitney U-test. If you have more than 3 groups, let's say you have a grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, you want to measure maybe mean weight in those different, maybe you have a hypothesis that maybe there's some sort of differences in weight for whatever reasons, then you can use ANOVA, but ANOVA can be 1-way or 2-way. 1-way ANOVA is where you're measuring a certain group, but when you have a 2-way ANOVA specifically is where you have 2 independent predictors that are influencing, maybe you can say weight and height are influenced by age or something like that. So MANOVA is where you have one dependent variable. Maybe you can say depression and mental, and maybe you can say anxiety and depression are being influenced by maybe grade of a student. So you want to see it's instead of measuring depression versus grade or anxiety versus grade, you can combine these two, depression and grade, because they are correlated, and look at them against grade. And then, as you said, non-parametric tests, this is where you don't have normal distribution. And in this case, you use a Mann-Whitney test in place of a t-test. And we say t-test is, you have two groups, you want to compare with the means between two groups. Kruskal-Wallis can be used in place of ANOVA. That is analysis of variance. So for categorical data analysis, for bivariate, you can use the chi-square test of dependence. And usually with chi-square, you want to see, you'll put your values in a 4x4 table. You want to see whether a certain outcome, whether you have diabetes or not, is influenced by maybe the amount of sugar you eat, maybe less than in a week, maybe less than maybe 100 grams versus over 100 grams. So you put that information in a contingency table, and when you calculate, you can get a Pearson chi-square or some sort of a chi-square, which gives you a p-value, and you're able to say that whether your p-value is significant or not based on your hypothesis. And the Fisher's exact test is just a simplification or a different version of chi-square, whereby if you have a cell, for instance, in this table, if you have a cell which is 5 or less than 5, then you can't interpret as chi-square. You can what you can use is Fisher's exact test. That is, if a cell has a value less than 5. And then you can have Macnema test. A Macnema test will normally tell you whether, let's say you administer, let's say you had 100 guys who you are going to do a surgical procedure to correct their vision. And then you want to see after the surgery, whether this, what is the effect of this surgery on vision. So you administer, so once you do the surgery, then you probably gonna have, initially you had maybe 90% of the guys who had worse vision, but this time maybe after surgery, maybe that number of worse vision has reduced to maybe around 50%. So there's a way you can compare that using a Macnema test, and then it tells you whether the change out of surgery is significant. But it's still a form of chi-square, but a manipulatable form that has been manipulated to fit that particular scenario. However, there are hundreds and hundreds of tests that can be run in a data set, and this is not exhaustive. There are so many of them out there, but then these are the common ones that I'm presenting here. But then you need to look at what kind of data do you have, or what kind of research question are you trying to answer. And once you're done with bivariate analysis, you move on to regression analysis. You can have a linear regression. If you can look at the first graph here where my cursor is, this is a linear where the value of X and Y, they're changing in the same pattern. An equal measure increase in X results from equal measure or increase in Y. So there you use linear regression. You can have a non-parametric version of linear regression is a Spearman rank, whereby as much as X is increasing and Y is increasing, but the pattern of increase is different. The gradient is not a straight line like you can see in this case. So in that case, you wouldn't use a linear regression. You would probably use a Spearman rank. But then there's still other models of linear regression where you have multiple linear regression, whereby you have various values of Y, and these ones you are looking them against a certain value of X, and you want to see whether how do all these other values of Y influence the changes in X variable. But then we have another model called logistic regression. This one is quite commonly used in healthcare analysis, if you're gonna come across quite some papers. And here basically you have a binary variable, which is you want to see whether having diabetes is influenced by maybe age, sex, maybe dietary habits, maybe stress levels. So you're looking at a variable that has two outcomes, has either yes or no. It's for binary logistic regression. But then you want to see whether this variable is being influenced by so many other factors. And this is a very powerful technique in data analysis, because it tends to give you very good values, and it has been used quite a lot. But then there are modifications of it. You don't. It's not just binary. You can even have data that exists in various 3, 4, 5 categories, and is multinomial logistic, which can be used in that particular scenario. And then there are measures of morbidity, which are usually incidence and prevalence. And you know that incidence is new number of cases in a given community of a disease over a given period of time. And you calculate it as such over the total population. And so is prevalence. Prevalence is the number of people who have at a particular point in time, or at a particular period of time, that they have a particular condition in a given population. So there are measures of sensitivity, there are measures of reliability and validity, and these ones we usually do sensitivity, specificity, accuracy, positive predictive value. And what is the importance? You can come up with a study where you can come up with a test or a diagnostic test that you think that this one we need to test it on whether it really tells us whether the patient has a problem or not. And in this case, you compare it against a gold standard, which is known, a known gold standard. So you want to test this against a known gold standard. So normally we'll give results in, you could read some papers, you find that sensitivity is 90% and a specificity of maybe 86%, something like that. Or you can think that a certain clinical symptom is really predicts some sort of a disease or some sort of a condition or diagnosis. So in this case, you can use the sensitivity. You can test it against a gold standard method, and then you are able to say that this clinical sign and symptom is able to actually tell me whether this person has disease by maybe 90%. And usually the results of this will be plotted in this kind of a receiver operator curve. And it is going to give you area under the curve. It's going to give you a p-value, and it's also going to give you sensitivity and specificity values. And then you can have measures of agreement, and the commonly used is the Cohen's-Kappa test, or the statistic. And here, ideally, you're trying to look at whether let's say for a scenario where you have a scoring system of fractures using X-rays, whether two surgeons or two radiologists agree in terms of if I give this one, are they going to say if a fracture is grade 3 or class 3, are they going to, what is their level of agreement on these grades of fractures? So there's a statistic for that. So you can design your study around that. And what it's going to tell you is whether there is poor agreement, fair agreement, moderate agreement, good agreement, or very good agreement. If it's very good agreement, probably that test is that scoring system, probably it's easier to work with in the population than one that doesn't have a good agreement. And then there are time series kind of data whereby you're looking at change in variable over a given time. And for instance, you could be looking at how a hormone changes, maybe, or over a given period of time. Or even, let's say guys have sustained head injury, they have been admitted to ICU. You want to see testosterone levels. How do they over a given period of time in the course of admission of this patient? And you can even advance this to look at what are the factors that are influencing those changes in those hormones. So you can do some sort of regression analysis, but that's topic for another day. And then there is survival analysis. Here you are assessing time to event analysis. And here you could be looking at time to death after diagnosis of cancer, or time to recurrence of cancer after maybe remission through medication or surgery. Or you could look at time to clearance of infection after you have given people some antibiotics. Or maybe you want to compare two antibiotics, which antibiotics clear infection faster in a certain group, maybe of guys, older people with pneumonia. So you want to see, if I give them this, but you need to have your outcome measures. How will you measure time to? How will you measure that clearance of infection? And then you administer your antibiotics. So you're going to get your results in overall survival, progression-free survival, median survival, hazard rates. And some of the techniques are used is a Kaplan-Meier survival curves. I'm sure most of us have come across these kinds of curves in a research paper. But this is basically survival analysis, and you the techniques to generate hazard rates, such as Cox proportionate hazard analysis. And this one is just a regression model, like logistic regression for now this particular kind of data. And of course, you have meta-analysis, which are some of the highest levels of evidence. And in this case, these designs tend to combine various study designs to derive an overall effect on the direction of evidence. And usually the results are given in odds ratios. And you can see here, this is a forest plot. And these guys were trying to assess whether smoking versus non-smoking does have an effect on development of atrial fibrillation. And you combine different stats. You can see this big square shows the weight of the study. Probably this study has more numbers of patients. And then you can see the line one is where the cutoff is. So if the odds ratio is on this side, it's plotted against that side. If the odds ratio is on the other side, it's plotted against this side. And at the end of the day, you get this diagonal triangle, which tells you where the level of evidence is. And then it gives you even a p-value. So in this case, you can see that smoking is associated with development of atrial fibrillation. So you can design a study around this. And by the way, what is the difference between a meta-analysis and a systematic review? Systematic review is basically your literature review. But now when you bring in the calculations aspect, now you call it a meta-analysis. And then the propensity score matching. These are new models of working with data, because it is, it's very difficult to prove causation, cause-effect association from observational studies. And basically, most of us, when designing our studies, we shall be trying to prove a cause-effect association. But then, in fact, the only study that allows you to really prove a cause-effect association is probably a randomized control study, and maybe to some extent a cohort study. But the gold standard is a randomized control study. But sometimes it's not possible to randomize patients for treatments, especially in cancer and other diseases, or when you have a treatment that's already working and the outcome is tragic. So you don't want to randomize. You want to first of all go with what is working. So these designs allow one to design and analyze an observation that is in a randomized study, so that it meets some particular characteristics of a randomized controls. And there are processes to achieving that. You calculate a propensity scores using a logistic regression, then you match using some techniques of matching, you evaluate quality of matching, and finally you come up with your conclusions. And then there is a concept of qualitative data analysis. Qualitative data analysis has gained traction in the recent past because it provides insight into depth of information about some factors which you cannot measure really through quantitative approaches, such as attitude, beliefs, motives, behaviors of people, even emotions, perceptions, actions of people who suffer from certain medical conditions. For instance, people may think that a certain condition is brought out by witchcraft. It's really gonna be very difficult to measure witchcraft through quantitative approaches. So you want to design your study around the qualitative approaches. Or even some things like if elderly people are falling in a community, you may want to know the exact circumstances that they fell. You cannot measure that through quantitative approaches. But there are methods of analyzing that. You can do triangulation or thematic analysis. This is whereby you look at whatever the concepts that people gave you, you read through them and try to see which themes are emerging from certain. Which themes are emerging? Like, for instance, in that example of people are falling in the community, older people, there's a guy who's gonna tell you, I was maybe untying my goat, and then I fell down. You can measure that quantitatively. It's probably difficult. And then, or there's someone else who's going to tell you I was drunk, and then I slipped maybe somewhere and fell. So you try to look at what are these, let's say that issue of tying goats, maybe 10 people give that opinion. So you're going to bring in, you're going to triangulate those and develop a theme from that, there's some association between goats and falling in the community. However, if you're dealing with big data, that is, you're dealing with variables running into millions of variables, it's difficult to, like, for instance, text data. It's difficult to do it manually, and you have to use softwares, and they're there, like NVivo, Atlas One. And how do you interpret results and present findings? Normally, we tend to use p-values. However, I find the p-values kind of rather uninformative. They are good, but they're not the best, by the way. Because one of the problems with p-values is that they don't tell you the direction of association. Because let's say something like smoking and depression. You come up with a hypothesis that smoking is associated with depression. The p-value, you get a significant p-value. What you don't know is whether is it the smoking that is causing depression, or is it probably is the relationship reverse? Is it the depression that's causing the smoking, or is smoking positively associated, or is it negatively associated? Maybe the guys who smoke have less depression, or the guys who smoke actually have more depression. So the p-values don't tell you everything, but somehow we still tend to use them because they can give you some sort of hint. But then for cohort studies, you can give relative risk, that is risk in the exposed divided by risk in the exposed, and also odds ratios for case control studies. And when you give these, then you have to interpret them on the basis of confidence intervals. You cannot give a relative risk or an odds ratio without discussing without giving the confidence intervals, because when the confidence interval the value 1 is involved in a confidence interval, that means that factor is not that significant. But when, let's say you have a confidence, let's say you have a p-value, you have a relative risk of 0.5 and confidence interval is 0, is maybe 0.4 to 0.6, that value is significant. And then there are post-hoc tests. For instance, if you run ANOVA, you may see it may tell you there is a significance difference between certain groups with a p-value, but it may not tell you exactly which groups have these differences. So post-hoc tests helps you to pick up these differences in specific categories of patients. And finally, how do you present your data? You can present your data through frequency tables. You can give it in prose format. You can visualize using techniques that we have discussed. You can give it in ratios. You can give it in rates. Maybe the rate of something is this. And still, there is this concept that has gained a lot of traction in the recent past, the artificial intelligence. And it has gained this because it has numerous applications in healthcare. And normally here, what we try to do is to develop predictive modelings that tells you whether a patient has a disease or not, whether there is a likelihood of an outcome, maybe mortality after diagnosis of cancer. You can develop an algorithm that tells you whether there's a likelihood of a patient sustaining. And this is based on clinical intuition. Like you can tell this from patients that you see, that you intrinsically know based on your practice that if a patient comes maybe with obstruction with certain signs, they're more likely to die than if a patient doesn't come with certain signs and symptoms. So you put this in an algorithm, and there are techniques for this, such as machine learning, deep learning, convolutional neural networks. And these are hundreds of algorithms around this, and there are softwares to analyze that. And you're able to, these ones, I think this is where medicine is moving in the future, because machines, especially, for instance, if you're going to use x-rays for diagnosing pneumonia, they have been found to work better even than the clinicians themselves, or even blood slides for diagnosing malaria. Machines have been found to, there are studies that have been done, and the machines nowadays are gaining more traction because they have been found to work better than even humans themselves, although they themselves are still prone to bias based on how those techniques were or how those algorithms are designed. And there are two approaches. Either the machine can learn, or you can feed it with data in what they call supervised and unsupervised learning. And there are various techniques for that. Yeah, so data is supposed to promote your intuition as a clinician. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Ernest. I think I'd like to hand the session over back to Dr. Mumba, just to confirm that you can all see my slides.
You can see the slides and you're audible enough.
All right, thank you so much, Mohammed. It's been 3 wonderful presentations from my colleagues, Dr. Mumba, Dr. Ernest, and Dr. Mose. They have set the stage for the workshop we'll be having later this evening, or rather later this morning, after this presentation that I will make briefly. I think we can take 2 minutes just to take a breather, grab a glass of water as we prepare for the next 15 or so minutes of transforming your thesis into a manuscript. So it's now 10:29. I will set off at 10:31. Great. So I think it's 10:31 by my watch. It's a cold morning in Nairobi. I don't know how the weather is wherever the rest of us are, but I'd like to take us through this session of transforming your thesis into a manuscript. So just as a preamble, what we'll be trying to talk about in the next 15 minutes is a situation where for most of our academic programs, especially from the master's programs, we are required to write up a thesis or a dissertation from a topic of interest. And usually this thesis may be very beneficial if it ends up being published. So we're going to try think about or walk through that journey, coming up with a manuscript from this voluminous thesis. All right. So the objectives we'll look at this morning are as follows. We're going to ask ourselves what's worth publishing. We're going to talk about the example of manuscript formats that we have. We're also going to think about what editors are looking for so that we can better be prepared in terms of what we put out. And we're also going to look at other people, what have they done in this part of the country or the world and other parts of the world? How many people actually end up publishing what they write up in their thesis or their dissertation? And then we'll highlight on the process. The process will even be discussed further during our breakout sessions in the workshop. And then finally, we'll have a take home to go by. This has been alluded by my previous presenters, and the level of evidence is in form of a pyramid, where the base here we have very low levels of evidence, and at the pinnacle here, as Dr. Ernest talked about, systematic reviews and meta-analysis being the highest level of evidence. Most of the studies that we do usually end up about this area here, from this blue-green to this yellow. Some of us are fortunate enough to take part in RCTs, and some of us are fortunate enough to be skilled to be able to write up meta-analysis and systematic reviews. So in terms of types of articles, often we'll have original research, which is often clinical or basic. This is usually what most of us will be doing, and especially surgeons or surgeons-to-be would be participating in a lot of clinical research. Cohort studies as well, where we review records especially, or review clinical cases over time. Clinical trials as well, randomized clinical trials being very popular, especially in this day and age. Systematic reviews, as I have talked about earlier. And I'll put this here just so that we realize that all these have certain guidelines and formats that we should follow. And for systematic reviews and meta-analysis, we have PRISMA guidelines, and we have a PRISMA statement, which we can all refer to, and the link is down here. We also have health science outcome research or audits, and often usually they make a lot of sense, especially when they're parts of large databases, and technique papers, especially for surgeons who have new techniques and want to communicate to the world about this. Other things that we have lower in evidence though are historical papers, case reports that are quite common, especially for people who are starting out, editorials often written by people who are senior members or authorities in their field. Often they are solicited and not submitted spontaneously. So Dr. Kigera, the editor-in-chief of the Annals of African Surgery, will reach out to author X, and author X is a premier urologist in the region, and they want their input on urine diversion, so they're going to ask them to write up an editorial. A letter to the editor can be in response to something that has been written in the journal. So as an author, you'll write responding to that. Papers on ethics, and a lot of this has been discussed by Dr. Mose, images as well, presenting unique pathology. It is quite clear that what you think is unique and from your center may not be actually publishable, especially if you do not have data to back this up. So I put together a list of guidelines for reporting different study types, and this is available on the website that I have provided down here, the Equator Network. So the idea is, for every study that you write up, there are guidelines as to how you should write it out. So it's not based on your institution, it's not based on you. There are some internationally accepted guidelines for the same. What do we do at Annals of African Surgery, or rather, which papers do we accept? We accept original papers. Usually we'll limit this to about 4,000 words and 25 references. Case reports, which are about 2,500 words and 20 references. Reviews, about 6,000 words, 40 references. We'll have invited editorials, as I earlier alluded, which are usually short papers, about 1,000 words with 10 references. And same goes to short communications, though these are not invited. Letters to the editor are also welcome, and this usually are about 600 words with 5 references. All these articles will often have an abstract, which is only about 200 words. It is worth pointing out that if these instructions are not met in terms of word count and references, we will have an initial screen once you submit the paper, and usually the paper will be sent back to you to adhere to these guidelines and won't even be subjected to peer review if this is not met. So this is a very important part of publishing. The other thing is that for every journal out there, they have a guide to authors, and this is a sample guide for authors from the Annals of African Surgery website. And from this, you'll realize that the journal team provides detailed requirements for what they need from every article. So they'll tell you the number of words you need to write, how you need to submit, what platform. And it's always wise to go ahead and look at this before you prepare your manuscript. It's also very relevant to email your editors and ask them if you have any questions, even before you submit your manuscripts. This is a resource that also has been shared with us from our previous presenters, and it is the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. So they have an outline for preparation of a manuscript and submission of the same to a medical journal. Going through these resources will definitely be useful even before you go ahead to prepare your manuscript. So then we go now to the daunting task, and I drew this from Matthew 19:24. So this says that it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. But then you need to think about this in terms of it being likened to a camel going through the needle eye, then this must be quite a difficult task then. So what you're trying to do is to summarize this book here. As you can see, it's quite voluminous, into a few pages of information that will be shared with the rest of the world. So when we look at what others have done in terms of what is the rate of conversion of manuscripts, or rather theses or dissertations to manuscripts, a few examples are cited here, and we see in some part of India, we looked at master's thesis from a university medical college, and we were trying to look at how many of them ended up being published in indexed scientific journals. So indexed scientific journals here is key. So the publication rate was about 30%, and publications were done. So out of all the theses that were written up, only about a third were published, and only about out of this third, the publication was between 8 months to 6 years since completion of the thesis. So let's put this into perspective. A candidate finishes their MMed general surgery, say January 2010, and most people will have published their work. Most people will actually not publish their work. So if we had a class of 100 people, only 30 guys will publish their work, right? And if we looked at how long it takes them to publish, so towards the end of 2010, we'll have some people beginning to publish until 2016. That is when we'll have the 30 people end up publishing, and of course the 70 others will not publish. Out of the people who ended up publishing, 54% of the people who were the students ended up being the first author. So you can imagine what happened to the 46 other percent. We go ahead to look at psychologists, or rather psychiatry residents, and only about 25%, so a quarter of them, were able to publish in between 0 to 7 years. So again, up to 2017, we were seeing a quarter of the people having published their work. Then we now move to closer home, to the general surgeons, and only about 22%, right? So a fifth, just a bit over a fifth of the people were able to publish, and it took them actually longer. So you can see the publication rate is a bit lower in the surgeons, and even it takes them longer. So you can imagine between 1 to 7 years. So the first publication we see from the general surgeons, and perhaps featured from about 2011, and then it took them up to 2017 and 2018 for this 20% to publish their work. When we look at what kind of studies they did and what was the rate of publication, we see here that cross-sectional studies were quite unpopular, with publishing rate as low as 11%. So about 10 out of 100 people were able to put out their work for publication, with the best being non-randomized prospective clinical studies. So you look at here the strength or the quality, the level of evidence here affecting the publication rate. So then we ask ourselves, how do we fix this? How do we do it then if we are to try and do better than this 22% that's out there? Mind you, we don't have data in our region, and my speculation would be that it may be lower than this 22%. So that right there, that's a study for some of us to maybe take up. What are the publication rates for master's thesis students? We can look at it in general surgery, in the general surgical procedures or general surgical courses. So this is something to think about as something worth exploring. So then we look at what we're trying to do. And the goal here is to compress and not to truncate. So what we mean by compress is that you will actually read through this information. And once you read through this information, you'll be able to understand and then paraphrase. You will not cut and paste. So the idea is to have these sections. So this often is your chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4 in the results, chapter 5, and conclusion is usually the chapter 6. So you're trying to break these chapters, which are about more than 100 pages, to 5 to 10 pages of an introduction section, which is usually 2 to 3 paragraphs, a method section, which is about 7 or so paragraphs, results, discussion, and limiting your references. You know, again, here we had 100+ references. We want to make them into a quarter. So this then becomes quite a challenging thing. Before we get into the process, we want to look at what differences are there between a thesis and a journal article. So if you look at a thesis, usually it is prescribed to meet academic requirements. So in terms of chapters, in terms of the various institutions will have their own ways of what they expect. And this one, the journal article will then be following the guidelines provided by the journals specifically. And of course, they will be different from journal to journal. We'll be reviewing this thesis that you write up, and the people reviewing it will know you. So a select number of committee members will look at it, right? And you'll even defend before them, and they'll get a chance to see you. And then in this journal article, we'll send this out to reviewers who are blind to you. Often they're your colleagues, you know, in a different part of the world. So we'll receive a paper on hand injuries from an orthopedic trainee in this country, and we will send it to an orthopedic trainee or an orthopedic surgeon in India, one in Zambia, one in the States, and one in China, and they'll give us their honest feedback. They will not know who you are. They'll not know that John is the one who wrote up this paper. And that means that your names will even be blinded and they'll be removed from the article even as it is sent out. This contains chapters, as I've alluded, 1 to 6, and this has sections, as I've talked about. In the thesis, we don't have word limits. Often you want to be as verbose as you can, you know. A thicker thesis often looks better. And in this, you want to be as succinct as possible. Word limits then being things that will determine whether your manuscript is accepted or not. Table of contents here will guide through the authors, and here manuscript format is what we have. We've talked about the length of the research in literature. So here we'll talk about so many things. We will discuss all aspects pertaining to this topic, and here we'll be quite succinct, mainly focusing on the issues that touch on the problem. So everything else will be excluded. Institutional review board approval will be described in detail. So you'll talk about submitting your proposal to ethics, Kenyatta National Hospital, UN, ERC is quite popular in this region. Then you talk about all the processes that you went through. You'll even give us your approval number. You'll even give us a copy of the approval. Here you'll just give 1 to 3 sentences that informed consent was obtained from the participants and the institutional review board that gave this ethical approval. You'll then give a description of the tools and the copies used, and then all findings will be presented. In here, we'll present some findings, and the tenses here will be quite inconsistent, while in the journal article, they'll be quite consistent. So in terms of the process, what do we want to do, or what are we looking at? So the first thing that you want to consider is the quality of your dissertation. So in some programs, like some I have been part of, you often have to do multiple dissertations. So you'll have a longer project, a shorter project, a literature review. So you'll realize from your from what you've done, the data you've collected, and the level of study, that the quality of each dissertation is different. So then this will guide your publication. And then the higher quality dissertations will then be preferred for publication. Authorship is another big thing that you'll need to consider even as you're starting off. So do you want to write this out alone? Which is often not a wise idea. Do you want to write this out with the assistance of your supervisors? Because often for your dissertations, you have supervisors, 2 or 3 quite frequently. And then do you want to include someone else to help you with this, someone who may have an extra opinion that may be valuable, but was not part of your supervising team? The next thing that you want to do is select a journal, and one that will be key in terms of readership. It has to be indexed, it has to be suitable in terms of what you have to offer. And then again, it needs to be a journal that realistically you can be able to publish in. So often you'll find that the journals that are more prestigious with high impact factors will take longer to publish in. So it also depends on if you have the grit to hold it out. The next thing is now actually trimming your thesis, and we will discuss further whether we'll be able to trim this thesis based on our objectives, whether we'll be able to trim this thesis based on just having one manuscript out of it. The next thing will be then to draft. So from here, you have 125 pages, and here you have about 10 pages. So here then you want to copy edit, and you want to make sure that this journal article then is ready or tailor-made for submission to the target journal, and then we go through the submission. So in terms of authorship, we've talked about this in brief, and there are 3 strategies here, where the author who wrote the dissertation or the student is listed as the lead author. So that would be, as Dr. Mose pointed out, that you're author number 1. Right? Of course, there is more value in being author number 1. And then the second author then would be that you have your dissertation supervisor being the second author. And then the third author being a second academic. So John is a plastic surgery student at Kenyatta National Hospital. He's given us a thesis on hand injuries. His dissertation supervisor is Dr. Mose. And we have a renowned plastic surgeon from the region. And maybe we have Dr. Kamau, who now comes in as the second academic. We can have where we have the dissertation supervisor. So now Mose becomes the lead author in this paper. And then the dissertation student becomes number 2. So John is now number 2. And then the third author is the academic, who is now Mr. Kamau, the prolific plastic surgeon. However, there's also this other scenario where the dissertation supervisor is the first author, and the second, more resourceful academic is the second author, and we can imagine the third author is the last. So this then ties up to our discussion that we had on ethics and authorship. So I don't know which author listing we prefer, A, B, or C. And I'm sure each of us has had different experiences with this. The next thing is to identify the best journal for your work. You consider one that your work should be within the journal's aim and scope. And the big question is how to find the right journal. So we'll use an example again of a resident in the region. So one has just finished their general surgery program at Makerere, and they have a dissertation on the occurrence or the prevalence of inguinal hernias in their region. And they're not sure where to publish it. So a few issues come to mind. So perhaps it's good to consider a surgical journal because the topic is surgical. Publishing in an African journal may give them good readership because the data then is quite useful there. Depending on the level of study and how robust the methods are and the quality of their work and their results, this will determine how big, quote unquote, journal they can publish in. So a guide for authors, again, link is shared here for you to be able to find whether the Annals of African Surgery is a suitable journal for your publication. You may also want to use automatic journal finders, and usually they can recommend a journal based on your manuscript title or your abstract. So the keywords here, your title and your abstract, become very key components of your manuscript. And an example is shared here, the Elsevier Journal Finder that can be used, and the second example as well. So then the third part is to write out your journal article. And we've said that we want to select parts of your journal article you want to read and repurpose this. So not to cut and copy, but to read and repurpose. So you'll be able to paraphrase what you have and be able to write this out. The reformat of the introduction can be done as an abstract. And the one thing I'd like to highlight on this study is that you can have two main strategies to this. So often when you do your thesis, you'll have a main objective or a primary objective, a secondary objective often, and other objectives as well. So in the secondary objectives, you'll have 3 or 4 objectives. So 1 may be to describe the demographic patterns, 2 may be to describe the clinical characteristics, 3 may be to talk about the prevalence, and 4 to talk about the outcomes. So then you can decide that you want to pick each objective and make that into a single paper. Usually people prefer this because of course they want more papers out of this. You may prefer to collect all your information and your results into one and convert your whole thesis into one manuscript. So it depends on the advice that you get from your seniors and your mentors and your personal preference as well. So you want to keep the method section succinct. This is short and clear. The main findings only are to be reported. Remember, in your thesis, you have lots and lots of findings, you know. Some parts of the findings of the gentleman from Makerere will be telling us that some were villagers, others walked to work, you know. But you want to focus on the main findings of your paper. Then you want to situate your findings in the literature. So if you're going to tell us about the rate of the prevalence of inguinal hernias then in Uganda, then perhaps you want to introduce the importance of knowing the prevalence of inguinal hernias in different parts of the world in your literature. Then you want to discuss your findings and expand the perspective of your field, of course. And then you want to present ways in which future studies can build upon and address limitations of the study that you have. So pitfalls that we often see from this section of writing is that in the research question, some dissertations cover several aspects and people usually don't narrow the focus. So they don't focus on one question and it ends up being quite confusing. Other authors will not bring the results under control, as I've pointed out earlier. So you'll find that the authors then are talking about results that really were not part of their research question that they want to publish. So if you want to publish on prevalence of the inguinal hernia in Uganda, then you will start telling us about something else, you know, the rate of diaphragmatic hernias as well was this. And really that wasn't part of your research question. So this is something we should be wary of. So try to avoid common presentation pitfalls of many novice writers. So be wary of how you write. And then certain conventions in dissertations do not lend themselves to presentation formats in journal work. So you'll find an author who's labeled their manuscript in chapters, you know, which does not lend itself to presentation formats in journals. The other thing, you want to be very selective about your references, and you want to focus on the ones that are most recent and the ones that communicate exactly what you want to say. In places in your thesis where you had 3 or 4 references, you can narrow it down to 1 or 2. An example of criteria that is used at the Annals of African Surgery is for all the references that you provide us with, we'll look at them and we'll ensure that 50% or more of them are as recent as 10 years. So we'll accept references up to 2011, 50% or more. So if you find that you're focusing on publications in your references that are more than 10 or 15 years old consistently through your work, then you probably want to revise that. Then in terms of your writing style, you want to avoid excessive reporting and repetition, and this is quite frequent in the thesis. You want to be careful not to overinterpret your data. So you want to only interpret your data based on your research question, and you want to write the discussion and conclude based on the data and the results that you've presented. So that needs to be very, very clear. Then the last part is something that I'd like to belabor. Reviewers and editors easily recognize a manuscript that has been carelessly converted from a manuscript. So this is something that we need to be aware of as authors and potential authors. If by any chance you have a manuscript that you have converted from a thesis and you do a shoddy work at this, So you don't you do your copy editing very well. You don't summarize it very well. You present a manuscript with 60 references. You present a manuscript that has chapters instead of sections as labeled. You present a manuscript with an abstract that is 800 words. The authors will know quite obviously that the editors and the reviewers will know quite obviously that this was previously a thesis that has not been really panel beaten well into a manuscript. And often you can imagine the response from the editors will not be one that is pleasant. Then the other thing is you want to prepare your manuscript for submission, and you want to use the criteria that the reviewers will use. So this is how you can cheat the system. Most of us are in our training programs, and journals are consistently recruiting reviewers, and even Annals of African Surgery is recruiting reviewers. A way to learn what reviewers will use is actually becoming one. So offering to review the work of your colleague in this region or elsewhere. So by being a reviewer, you actually have a sneak peek behind the curtain and you know exactly what to look out for. Then you want to get a read from a sympathetic friend or a mentor. And you also want to ask another colleague who thinks differently to read your work, all right? And then you also need to find someone to edit and do copy editing and language checks for you. This is especially where English is not your first language, but it is advisable to have it done all the same for everyone. It is actually not very embarrassing in this day and age to engage professional proofreaders. So this is a brief outline of the stages that we'll go through. So one, you'll plan to convert the dissertation to an article. Then you'll start writing this article. You'll advance your argument. You'll select a journal, and we've talked about how to look for one, manually or through journal finders. Then you'll review literature around this. You'll crystallize it, and then strengthen the structure. You'll present the evidence therein, and those are your results. Opening and concluding of the article. Feedback will be received from your colleagues and your mentors. Then you'll have copy editing services for you, wrapping up, and then finally sending the journal article out. And you can imagine this is stage 12. So you can imagine quite a number of stages. Then at this point, the journal will review your article and will give you feedback, and then you can move from there. So as I conclude, I'd like to give us 7 quick rules that we can always try and fall back on when we are thinking about converting our thesis into a manuscript. Is that one, a summary of the dissertation will not suffice, all right? So the cut and copy will not suffice. A thick description is often necessary, and thick is not in terms of verbosity or number of words, but in terms of trying to justify or explain the concepts therein. It is very advantageous to collaborate with colleagues. So then that means working alone perhaps is not the wisest thing to do. And then it is essential to adhere to guidelines and deadlines. So guidelines we've discussed, and these are often available on the website. Deadlines are things that will be communicated to you in correspondences between you and the editors. So they'll tell you about that you need to submit your review or your corrections in 6 weeks. So it is in your best interest then to resubmit within 6 weeks because your article may then be rejected based on your inability to adhere to the guidelines. Revise and resubmit is quite common. It is very unusual that you will present your article and you will get it in on the first try. So data out there suggests that premium journals with very high impact factors and that are highly sought after will have an acceptance rate of about 10%. And for some, we'll have an acceptance duration of up to 2 to 3 years. So then this is something that you want to think about. The last thing is you want to be careful of electronic journals. So in this day and age, there's a lot of predatory publishing. So you find that most journals don't have an impact factor, they are not peer reviewed, or a few other things that are looking suspicious about this. It's not indexed. So these are the things that you want to consider before you submit to this journal. And then finally, patience is key because it's a long and treacherous process. Thank you very much. I'll respond to any questions if there are any. You can reach out to us on the above contact information.
Thank you very much, Brian. At this juncture, let's take some questions for, I think, 5 minutes before we are separated into the breakout sessions. We have 81 participants. This is very good. You can raise your hand and we will unmute you, or alternatively, you can send messages in the chat.
There's a question in the chat. Maybe Mohammed, you can read it out.
So someone asks, for the number of words being talked about here, is it minimum or that's the maximum number? No, this is directed to.
So I'll happily jump onto that, Mohammed, if you'll allow me.
Yes,
And response to the question by Alfred is, in terms of, not Alfred, rather, Eric, the number of words that I've presented here and most places you find are the maximum number of words. So it's okay for your original article to have 3,591 words. If the upper limit then is 4,000. But then if you present your manuscript and the number of words is 4,200, where 4,000 is the upper limit, perhaps it will not be acceptable.
Thank you very much for that response. Someone else asked, what is the role of identification and use of a prototype journal for guidance?
So thank you for that, Mohammed. Alfred asks, what's the role of identification? Okay, there's a correction there. What is the role of identification and use of a prototype article for guidance? I think I'm not really getting the question clearly. I don't know if any one of my colleague editors understands what Alfred is trying to put out.
Maybe I could assist on that one.
Yeah, thanks, Doc.
I think, Alfred, I don't know if I got your question right. What you're asking is, what is the role of using a prototype journal in terms of their guidance? For example, you could pick the guidelines that have been put in place with Annals of African Surgery in terms of manuscript submission, because they differ from journal to journal. So let's say you pick ours, they will not quite differ as much. We play within the same rules, just a few differences here and there, so that if you're publishing for the first time, you have no idea. If you pick ours and you submit still to a different journal, the rules don't vary as much. And the guidance will pretty much be the same in terms of how many words, the image size that you should put, the number of your citations, the range of years that is acceptable, and how much older shouldn't they be? Like in our journal, we say it has to be at least 10 years or less. And if it is more than 10 years old in terms of referencing, then that means you have to justify why you picked a very old document. You see, these rules they're pretty much the same. They just a few differences from journal to journal. So if you pick one and you use it, then if it's your first time, you're highly likely playing within the rules. I hope I answered you, Alfred. Back to you, Mumba.
Someone else? Okay.
I should here. Okay, I'm just going to read the questions one by one. So we've answered the number of questions, is it minimum or that's maximum? So it's the maximum, it's the guidance for the maximum. What is the role of identification and use of a prototype journal for guidance? What is the role of identification and use of a prototype journal for guidance? Editors,
So
would you like to tackle that?
Those have been tackled already.
Yes, Dr. Kigero.
Yeah, I think those were tackled. I think the next question is on the plagiarism.
What is the value of publishing?
Yeah, publishing. Yes, that's the next one. Yeah, yes. That's the next question.
The next one is what is the value of publishing in a journal that has no metrics, nor indexed in scholarly journals? I think Brian had touched on this to say you're aiming to publish in an indexed journal. Brian, did you want to just follow up on that?
Thank you, Dr. Mumba. So it's a question that has many answers, really. The value of publishing in a journal that has no metrics. So the implication is this: if your journal is not indexed or does not have some metrics out there, means that perhaps the viewership or the readership will be on the lower end as opposed to one that is indexed. All right. The other thing is that in terms of quality or how rigorous the review is and the quality of manuscripts that they accept, usually the ones that have indexed and have metrics will have higher standards. So, and of course, higher standards means that the quality of publications then is better. So it's preferred that you publish in a journal that has metrics or is indexed. But in the event that this is not possible, publishing in one that is not indexed or that is on a path to being indexed is also good enough, yes, as opposed to not publishing at all.
Thank you, Dr. Brian. On plagiarism, confirm if there is a minimum percentage allowed considering the use of various plagiarism checkers. I'm assuming you're talking about, for example, the Turnitin percentages. If we understand you right, Tony. I'll allow Dr. Mose to touch on that as she had talked about plagiarism. Dr. Mose.
Thank you, Tony, for that question. When it comes to plagiarism, usually we actually advise our authors to also run their work through the plagiarism checkers before submission so that they also know the percentage before we run. However, if you've not run, we're still going to run. But as we run, we omit when the percentage comes, it is actually divided into different sections, because if you run it in your references, then definitely it's going to give you a high percentage. So when you look at the Similarity Index, we look at the content of your work only, while excluding the references so that it's not so high. The lower it is, of course, the better for you. According to our journal, we accept at least 10%. So, but we omit the references because of course it's going to put it higher. So we deduct the references, and then if you had run it, of course, through a university, again, it will give some sort of similarity. So we just look at the content of your work. If at that point it is more, of course, more than 10 or 15, then you have to work on it a bit more. But it varies from journal to journal.
Thanks. The next question will be, how much does one pay for his manuscript to be published? Dr. Benjamin asks, how much does one pay for his manuscript to be published? I think I'll allow Dr. Kigera to tackle this. And maybe you can also touch on generally paying, how paying for publishing works and our position as annals.
So the long answer is that there's two main models of journal financing. One is subscription-based, and the other is open access. The challenge, sorry about that bird. The challenge with open access is that the burden of financing the journal is taken to the authors, and that's why you then would pay a subscription fee. The journal has the journal that is the Annals of African Studies has been mainly open access without charges. However, this has changed as from July, and if I'll be allowed to, I just want to share our website and allow guys to see this. So this is on our website, and basically there is a charge of 100 USD from those who are from outside the continent, and 60 USD for those who are within the continent. For students or people who may want to seek a waiver, then you send an application to the editor-in-chief. Thanks, Dr. Mumba.
Thank you very much for that response. Dr. Kigera is our editor-in-chief, for those who may have joined late. Another question, when someone publishes in predatory journals, does it really count as scientific publication? Who was talking about publishing? I think it was Ernest, no? Or Brian? Dr. Brian or Dr. Ernest, our presenters, do you want to touch on predatory journals and does it count as scientific publication? Or was it Dr. Mose? Any one of the editors, please go ahead. I can't remember who touched on it. Go ahead.
Thank you, Doc. I am happy to respond to this question. So the concern is, does publishing in a predatory journal really count as a scientific publication? So this is the thing. A predatory journal may actually not be real. So in the situation or in the scenario where they have created perhaps a fake website, the journal does not exist. Maybe they're collecting your work for their own malicious plans, you know, to share it with others or to sell it off. Often that will not count. And usually they will not, this will be a journal that's not indexed. This will be a journal that doesn't even have a print copy. So often that one will not be acknowledged. But now some journals are coming up or new, and this will be acknowledged. Something that is important to check out is, are they going to give you a DOI number? So once you publish your article with them, and will it be available for others to read? And in terms of availability, will it be archived? So it's a big answer to this question. And even Dr. Kigera can elucidate more on it. But for the real predatory journals, most of your scientific publications will not be acknowledged.
I am excited that we've managed to come to the end of this workshop. It is challenging to try and use technology to run a workshop like this, but I think we have managed to pull off quite a feat. I want to thank everybody who has attended this workshop from the beginning. It's been about 5-6 hours of learning, which is not easy, especially when it's virtual. And I want to give lots of kudos to the team that managed to put this together, my team of editors and interns. Thanks a lot for dedicating your time and for letting us learn from you. So from the people who've attended, I just want to do two things. One, I want to open up the chat now, and I'd like you guys to tell us what you would want us to do for the next workshop. What are the things that you would want to learn in the next workshop? Please just type that in the chat we'll record that and we will see how we can take care of your needs. I want to thank Cosecsa for allowing us to do this as a pre-conference workshop for the Cosecsa workshop. It is quite difficult to try and manage running workshops in this COVID era. We have done this pre-conference workshops for the last 4 or 5 Cosecsa workshops. It is my sincere hope that the next one, hopefully in Namibia, will be a physical one, and that's probably much easier to do some learning. So I want to thank everybody, and before I give this to Mumba, I want to run a poll. And the purpose of this poll is for you to let us know what went well, what didn't go very well, and so that we know how to improve the next time. The chat is still open for you to give us ideas for the next workshop. Please find the questionnaire and answer the questions that you are seeing over there. The first question is asking about the objectives for the workshop. And then we are asking about participation. We're asking about the topic relevance, and then the organization and training experience, whether it will be useful in your work, were the trainers well prepared, whether the time was okay, and your best workshop. I can already see a good number of you have started giving in your responses. Please take a few seconds to let us know how it went. Like I had mentioned, we will try and post this recordings on our website, and you will get an email once this information is available on the website. I'd like you to encourage your colleagues who were not able to attend to have a look at the recordings. Unfortunately, the group work, because it happens in the different rooms, is not recorded, but I am I'm sure that we will be able to tell our colleagues how it went, and they can then choose to participate in the next one. So Dr. Mumba, back to you. I'm going to leave the poll open so that everyone gets a chance to answer. About 15 of us have not yet answered. So please, 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 if you've not done the polls, please go in there and let us know what you think about today's workshop. Dr. Mumba, back to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kigera. I think this has been a wonderful workshop. Even for myself as an editor, I have learned a lot and revised quite a bit of our writing, publishing skills and theories. So I'm pretty excited about that. If you haven't done the poll, please go ahead and do the poll. I think we're doing well on time. It was scheduled to finish just about now. So we've done very well on time. The participants have done pretty well. Unless there are any other burning issues, I think on behalf of myself, on behalf of the Annals of African Surgery, we are so glad that you came. A big thank you to the participants for taking out time on a Saturday. A big thank you to our editor-in-chief for pushing us to the very last minute and waking us up in the morning. A big thank you to my colleagues, the editors, the interns. It was really a team effort, and we're looking forward to seeing each other physically at the next one. Please send in the chat anything else you want us to cover, and look out for a workshop by the Annals of African Surgery coming nearest to where you are and look to see if you can attend one of our workshops. We are really exciting in person. If you were not very entertained by us, trust us, in person we're even more exciting. I think that's it from us. Dr. Kigera, has everyone answered the poll before I officially close? I'm closing at 12:40 by the powers vested in me.
Yes, so a few people have not quite answered, so I'll let it run for as long as we have time, maybe another couple of minutes. So we can end, but I'll let the poll continue running for those who've not answered to answer.
All right, that's fine. So on behalf of myself as the master of ceremony versus, what is it called in a Zoom? In a Zoom conference, I think it should be moderator. Yes, moderator is the word I'm looking for. I think this has been a very successful workshop. Let's see. Thank you so much for this workshop. Online workshops are a blessing. For the next one, I'd like to see a more in-depth workshop and exercise on critiquing papers, okay? To be able to get more objective assessment of all the different papers out there from the countless pool of papers available worldwide. Blended workshops are also feasible. They don't have to be fully online or offline in today's world. Thank you so much, Mohammed, for that. How to get funding, whether for thesis writing or research. That's from Kazembe. Thank you, very insightful it has been. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. Okay, I think from me, that's me signing off for now. Those who haven't answered, please go ahead and answer the questions in the poll. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a happy Saturday ahead and submit your papers for publishing. We expect to see more of those manuscripts. Have a good afternoon.